So here we are, treated to the spectacular grotesquerie of Donald Trump, a man whose personal Vietnam was dodging sexually transmitted diseases at Studio 54, summoning America's military brass to Marine Corps Base Quantico on September 30th for what can only be described as a loyalty inquisition. The scene itself defies satire. A 5-time draft deferment recipient, whose bone spurs miraculously healed the moment the danger passed, now presiding over generals who've spent decades in actual combat zones, informing them of their inadequacies. The September 30th address to military leadership wasn't merely a meeting. It was a degradation ceremony that cost millions to orchestrate, flying in over 800 generals and admirals from around the globe at taxpayer expense. Here was Trump, in a rambling 75-minute harangue, essentially demanding that men who've buried soldiers under foreign flags swear fealty not to the Constitution they've defended with their lives, but to him personally. The message, delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to crystal, was unmistakable. Prepare to fight the enemy from within. And then there's Pete Hegseth, Trump's Secretary of War. Yes, he's actually renamed it that, as if we're living in 1789, a man whose military expertise appears to consist primarily of weekend Fox News punditry and whose physical prowess is, shall we say, more theoretical than demonstrated. This is the individual who stood before the assembled brass and railed against fat generals, declaring physical fitness paramount while himself unable to do a proper pull-up, while serving a president whose idea of exercise involves a golf cart. Hegseth, who speaks of warrior culture with the fervor of someone who's watched 301 too many times, actually had the audacity to invoke the names of Patton and Schwarzkopf while dismissing decorated commanders like Generals Milley, Mackenzie, and Chiarelli as insufficiently warrior-like. The irony is so thick you could spread it on toast, though it would likely prove indigestible. Hegseth thunders, "No more DEI offices, dudes in dresses, no more climate change worship. We are done with that shit," while genuflecting before a commander-in-chief who resembles an orange Jabba the Hutt, a president whose understanding of military sacrifice extends no further than considering his business career equivalent to military service. "The era of the Department of Defense is over," Hegseth declared, as if renaming something the Department of War would somehow transform cable news punditry into military expertise. What we witnessed at Quantico was nothing less than an attempt to transform the American military from a professional force bound by oath to the Constitution into something altogether more sinister. Trump's declaration that the military must prepare for a war from within, that American cities should become training grounds for military operations, carries the unmistakable stench of authoritarian ambition. When he proclaimed his new doctrine, "They spit, we hit. Is that okay?" to a room of silent generals, he wasn't asking a question. He was issuing a threat. Consider the actual words used: accusations of disloyalty, threats of courts-martial, promises to clean out the senior ranks. This is the language of purges, not performance reviews. Stalin would recognize the rhetoric, though he might advise more subtlety. The generals sitting in that room, men like Mark Milley, who Trump has explicitly threatened with execution for treason, represent the thin line between constitutional governance and military autocracy. These are officers who've studied not just warfare, but the collapse of democracies, who understand that when civilian leaders demand personal loyalty over constitutional duty, the republic itself hangs in the balance. The appointment of Pete Hegseth deserves special attention, if only for its breathtaking cynicism. Here's a man who sermonizes about warrior culture and military readiness, while serving a president who called Americans who died in war losers and suckers. Hegseth thunders about the need for tough leadership, while his own toughness remains conspicuously undemonstrated beyond the safe confines of television studios. His crusade against woke military policies, which apparently include such radical notions as women serving in combat roles and the military reflecting the diversity of the nation it defends, comes from someone whose own military service, while honorable, hardly qualifies him to lecture generals who've commanded hundreds of thousands of troops in actual warfare. It's rather like a small-town mayor presuming to instruct the architects of D-Day. But Hegseth serves a purpose beyond his dubious qualifications. He's the perfect instrument for Trump's military takeover, telegenic enough for the cameras, obsequious enough for Trump's ego, and willing to mouth whatever authoritarian nonsense is required to transform the military into a personal Praetorian Guard. What options do these military leaders have when confronted with such naked authoritarianism? They can resign en masse, leaving the military in the hands of whatever lackeys Trump would install. They can resist and face courts-martial on fabricated charges, or they can try to navigate the impossible strait between their oath to the Constitution and the demands of a would-be dictator. The threats aren't subtle. When Trump speaks of generals who should be gone or who deserve court-martial, he's not engaging in hyperbole. He's telegraphing intentions. When he demands investigations into officers who oversaw the Afghanistan withdrawal, while conveniently forgetting he negotiated the timeline with the Taliban, he's creating pretexts for purges. These generals know history. They know what happened to the German general staff when they thought they could manage Hitler. They know what happened to the Soviet officer corps when Stalin decided loyalty meant submission. They're watching the same playbook unfold in real time, only with more tweets and less subtlety. Make no mistake about what we're witnessing. This isn't normal civilian oversight of the military. This isn't about policy disagreements or strategic differences. This is about transforming America's military from a professional force dedicated to constitutional governance into an instrument of personal power. The January meeting was a declaration of intent: submit or be destroyed. The message to every officer in the chain of command was clear. Your oath to the Constitution means nothing compared to loyalty to Trump. Your decades of service, your combat experience, your professional judgment, all worthless unless accompanied by complete submission to the dear leader's whims. The fact that this is happening in the United States of America, not some struggling democracy or tin-pot dictatorship, should terrify anyone who understands what's at stake. We're watching the methodical dismantling of civil military norms that have protected our democracy since Washington voluntarily relinquished his commission. The spectacle of draft dodgers questioning the patriotism of combat veterans, of cable news commandos lecturing actual commanders, of a president who thinks military parades should be about him rather than the troops, all of this represents not just a degradation of norms, but an assault on the very concept of professional military service. When Trump tells these generals they need to be loyal, he's not talking about loyalty to America. When Hegseth rants about warrior culture, he's not talking about military effectiveness. They're talking about personal fealty, about transforming the world's most powerful military into a palace guard for a would-be autocrat who wouldn't know sacrifice if it bit him on his bone spurs. The generals sitting in that room watching this farce unfold understand what many Americans still don't. They are all that stands between us and the abyss. Their professional integrity, their commitment to their oaths, their willingness to resist illegal orders, these aren't just military virtues. They're the last pillars holding up the constitutional order. History will not be kind to this moment. It will record that the American military, that institution that defeated fascism and stood watch against totalitarianism for decades, was forced to defend itself against domestic enemies who wrapped themselves in the flag while attempting to destroy everything it represents. The question isn't whether Trump and his enablers like Hegseth will continue their assault on military professionalism. They will. The question is whether the generals will hold the line, whether the officer corps will remember their oaths, whether the institution itself will survive this unprecedented attack from within. That we must even ask these questions, that we must wonder whether American generals will resist becoming instruments of authoritarian rule, tells us how far we've fallen. The draft dodger lecturing war heroes about courage, the Fox News personality defining warrior culture, the would-be dictator demanding personal loyalty from those who've sworn to defend the Constitution. This isn't just irony, it's tragedy. And the most chilling part, we're only at the beginning.